The man known to history as Eamon DeValera was born in New York City on the 14th of October 1882. His father Vivion died the following year, and Eamon was brought back to Ireland by his uncle Eddie Coll in 1885. This was just 30 years after the Great Famine, which had devastated Ireland a generation earlier. Hello everyone, we're talking today about Eamon DeValera, and as an infant of 3 years of age he arrived back in Limerick with his uncle Eddie Coll. And he arrived back to a country that was still largely devastated by the famine, and he grew up as a young child listening to stories about the effects of the famine, and that had a huge influence on him for the rest of his life. However, by the time he was about 12 years of age, he left the local school and went on to the Christian Brothers for 3 years. And around the age of 14 or 15 years of age, he discovered he had a tremendous talent for maths, and he got top room marks and passed into Blackrock College in Dublin, where he later studied advanced maths and became a lecturer of teachers. However, DeValera also developed an interest in the Gaelic League, developed an interest in the Irish language and the revolutionary spirit of the times, and he joined the Gaelic League to learn to speak Irish. Here he met his future wife, Sinead Flanagan, who he married in 1910. 3 years later, in 1913, he joined the Irish Volunteers with the aim of enforcing Home Rule. This was in response to the Ulster Volunteers, which had been set up the previous year to resist Home Rule. So by 1912-1913, the north and south of Ireland were beginning to drift in different directions. DeValera joined the Volunteers actually in 1913 and quickly became a leading member, writing an instruction manual for new recruits on the use of weapons. By 1914, he was captain of the Donnybrook Company and helped to hide weapons imported by Erskine Childers. DeValera gradually came to realise that the Volunteers were largely controlled by a Fenian movement, the IRB, or the Irish Republican Brotherhood. They were a secret organisation, and DeValera joined them in 1915. He gave Paraic Pearse a commitment that he would accept any orders in the event of an uprising. The First World War caused a split within the Volunteers. The majority of 60,000 followed John Redmond's advice to fight for Britain in return for Home Rule. However, a more militant minority of 10,000 men refused to fight. Instead, this minority planned a rebellion against the British Empire. DeValera was part of this minority and defended the south side of the city during the Rising. So just to say something about the 1916 Rising at this point, DeValera left the house on Good Friday morning, a few days before the Rising. And he basically found that because of a split in the Volunteers between Eoin MacNeill and Paraic Pearse, that 3/4 of his men was missing, so that instead of 500 men, he was left with 125 or 30 men. And he basically had the job of defending the south side of the city from the British coming in from Dunleary. So that was an extremely brave effort, given his reduced manpower to do that job. The loss of the 20,000 rifles a week earlier meant that the Rising could never really be a military success. However, the leaders saw this as a now or never moment, and that's why they went ahead. The rebellion basically was crushed within a week, and in the weeks that followed, 16 leaders of the Rising were executed. DeValera just missed death by a single day. The British government had come to realise that the executions were basically outraging the public, who seen the main source of the problem as British misrule. Although he was saved from death, DeValera spent the next year in English jails along with hundreds of Irish rebels. As the main surviving leader of the Rising, he returned to Ireland in 1917 to a hero's welcome and was elected an MP for Clare, and he also became president of Sinn Fein. During 1918, Britain was running short of soldiers on the war front, and they tried to introduce conscription in Ireland. However, Sinn Fein opposed this and greatly increased their popularity as a result. That, combined with the execution of the 1916 leaders, gave Sinn Fein a massive victory in the general election in December 1918. Sinn Féin's objection to conscription caused DeValera and many other leaders to be imprisoned again, with the result that there were only 28 members present for the first Dáil at the Mansion House. DeValera escaped from Lincoln Jail in February 1919 and went to America in June to gain recognition for the new state and raise much-needed funds from Irish Americans. He travelled to all the major US cities. Hundreds of thousands of Irish Americans came out to see him. He raised millions of dollars. However, he was less successful in gaining recognition for the new state, as Irish-American leaders like John Devoy were aware of the British-American war effort and the extreme difficulty involved in influencing US foreign policy. So after 18 months, DeValera returned to Ireland in December 1920. At this stage, Ireland was involved in the War of Independence with Britain. However, Lloyd George called a truce in June 1921 and invited De Valera to London to talks. More detailed talks took place in the treaty negotiations in November 1921. These were led by Arthur Griffith and Michael Collins. De Valera remained in Dublin in order to retain unity within the Sinn Fein organisation. In the treaty, there was a significant difference between what Sinn Fein demanded and what the British offered. When Collins and Griffith got back to Dublin with the signed treaty, there was huge disagreements within the Sinn Fein organisation. De Valera believed nothing should be signed without his approval. Others were angry at the fact that the treaty did not grant full Irish independence. 3 major ports were still under British control. Irish politicians were to swear an oath of allegiance to the British Crown. The office of Governor-General would supervise Irish affairs. The country was to be partitioned, with a final boundary of Northern Ireland being decided by a boundary commission. These issues created huge, heated debate. However, the treaty was actually approved by 64 votes to 57, and this caused De Valera and his followers to walk out of Dáil Éireann in protest. In the early months of 1922, both sides sought to occupy military barracks being vacated by the British. The pro-treaty side won the general election in mid-June 1922, 58 seats to 36. On the 28th of June 1922, Michael Collins ordered an attack on the Four Courts, and this was seen as the first major event of the Civil War. A few weeks later, Arthur Griffith died on the 12th of August, and Michael Collins was assassinated at Bale-na-Blá 10 days later. The Civil War lasted about 10 months and cost almost 2,000 lives. However, in April 1923, De Valera asked the volunteers to dump their arms as the anti-treaty forces could not achieve victory. Following the Civil War, De Valera found himself in a political wilderness for a couple of years. In March 1926, he proposed a motion to the Sinn Féin Ard Fheis to allow members to take their seats in Dáil Éireann if the oath of allegiance was abolished. This motion, however, was rejected, and he split from Sinn Féin on this point. A week later, on the 2nd of April, he founded a new party, Fianna Fáil, at the La Scala Theatre in Dublin. The following year, 1927, Fianna Fáil won 44 seats at its first election, and Sinn Féin was reduced to 5. De Valera signed the oath of allegiance while verbally stating that his only allegiance was to the Irish nation. The new party aimed to represent and help small farmers, the working class, the unemployed and the poor. They outlined an ambitious programme in housing to improve the appalling living conditions of the poor. De Valera was also keenly aware of the need for positive publicity. In 1927, a US court released funds raised by De Valera on his 1920 American tour. These funds were frozen as a result of a row between De Valera and the Irish American leadership. Part of these funds were now used to set up the Irish press and promote the Fianna Fáil viewpoint. In 1929, the Boundary Commission reported, but failed to recommend any transfer of territory from Northern Ireland to the south as anticipated. The Wall Street crash of '29 also created a more difficult economic environment. All these issues now contributed to the growth of Fianna Fáil and the 172 seats in the 1932 general election. They formed a minority government with the support of Labour. However, De Valera called a snap general election in January 1933 and won an overall majority with 77 seats. From there, he began to reduce the role of the office of Governor-General. He stopped the payment of the land immunities to the British government. The British reacted by imposing high taxes on Irish exports to Britain, and this in turn triggered the economic war of the 1930s between the two countries. In 1936, there was a major constitutional crisis in Britain. The King, Edward VI, resigned in order to marry American divorcee Wallis Simpson. De Valera took advantage of this situation by calling Dáil Éireann into an emergency session. They passed 2 bills, one to get rid of the Oath of Allegiance and the other to abolish the office of the British Governor-Generalship. These were very popular measures, and the following year, 1937, De Valera won an overall majority and passed a new constitution by referendum on the same day. The new constitution set up the office of Taoiseach as head of government and president of head of state. It also contained a provision whereby it can be changed by the will of the people in referendum, which has happened on several occasions. The following year, Fianna Fáil conducted the Anglo Irish Agreement with the British government. This brought the economic war of the 1930s to an end, and also the British government accepted 10 million as a final settlement for the land annuity payments. It also established free trade between the two countries except for a few protected industries. Most importantly, it returned the major ports to Irish ownership and thereby allowed Ireland to maintain neutrality during the Second World War. A few months later, in 1940, Churchill became Prime Minister of Britain, and he offered to unite Ireland to DeValera in return for participation in the war, but basically DeValera didn't trust him. There wasn't a great relationship between the two men. And Churchill sort of at one stage, at the end of the war, he's bragging about the fact that Britain stood up against Hitler for 12 months. And DeValera replied to that, what's called the historic reply. He showed that Ireland stood up against Britain for several centuries, which was a far greater achievement, relatively speaking. So that DeValera actually made an immense contribution to the history of the state over several decades. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe to the channel.